This is the Amazon Planet Podcast, Episode 12, Visiting Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I am your host, Joel Amadon, and I hope this recording finds you well. Thank you for taking the time and effort to seek out this podcast and listen. I know there are many choices out there, and I also know that your time is valuable, so let's just get into it. This episode of the podcast features the book The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers by Maxwell King. Now, there's a story behind this book. You're going to hear about it in the episode, but when I was thinking about episodes for the podcast and I saw that the movie, the Mr. Rogers movie that's going to be coming out on November 22nd, and the day we're recording this is the 18th, and I thought, this would be a good thing to do. And I thought, who would be a good person to go get and read this book and talk about it with me? Because as I'm finding out, these episodes are so much better when they're with somebody else. So I was looking for a good partner in crime, and I found one. And that's my good friend and colleague, Dr. Ann Monroe. Now, you heard Dr. Ann Monroe on episode 10 in the Opportunity to Develop. She and I did a presentation with our colleague Candice Cook up in Nashville for the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics Conference. And so you heard about her talking about some of her learnings about, I believe it was standards-based grading in that episode. But anyway, she's back. She's back to talk about Mr. Rogers, and she has some passion for Mr. Rogers. You'll get into that in the episode. But a little bit about her, because she doesn't talk about herself all that much, and I want to brag on her a little bit. So Dr. Ann Monroe is Assistant Dean and Director of Assessment and Associate Professor of Teacher Education in the Department of Teacher Education at the University of Mississippi. She's fantastic. She has won several awards for her teaching and service, including her most recent award, which is the Elise M. Hood Outstanding Teacher for the University of Mississippi. That's not for the School of Ed. That's not for the Department of Teacher Ed. That's for the whole university. And that, in my opinion, was an honor due to her. Her teaching is fantastic. There's a lot that can be learned from her and her passion, not only for her students, but not her students' and you're going to hear about that in the episode as well. And just excited for you all to listen to this episode. So let's not delay anymore. But before we do that, just a reminder that the purpose of the Amazon Planet podcast is to learn how to teach better. And I can't think of better content to go through than this book, and especially with regards to reading a purpose statement like this, because when you read a purpose statement like this and then you read a book like Mr. Rogers, you know that you need to follow a statement like this up with some action, or better yet, that your actions are the statement. But anyway, we give the statement as a kind of a lead-in always to the podcast. And the goal of the podcast, my own personal goal, is to lead people to love others through teaching. And following in the footsteps of someone like Fred Rogers. And just, again, and as as we say all the time, we're going to talk about this book by Maxwell King about the life and work of Fred Rogers. It's not going to come near to capturing all the brilliance of Fred Rogers that's in this book. And really, this was a passion project of Maxwell King, and talking with the family of Fred Rogers after he passed. You're like, you know what? This needs to be done. This biography needs to be done. It needs to be written. It needs to be captured so it can be shared. And I'm so glad that they made the decision to share his life, share Fred Rogers' life with people through this book. And so, anyway, we're not going to be able to cover this whole book. We're not going to capture it in its entirety. What you hear is our perspectives on this book. If you like what you hear, you know what I'm going to say. Go get the book for yourself. Links to purchase the book can be found in the show notes at AmazonPlanet.com/episode 12, or seek it out wherever you buy high-quality books like this one. If possible, try to support your local bookseller, like Square Books, here in Oxford, Mississippi, which I believe is where this book came from. All right, no more delays. Here's my discussion of The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers, with Dr. Ann Monroe. Enjoy. Ann Monroe, thank you so much Dr. Monroe, thank you so much for being willing to come on the podcast and talk about Mr. Rogers.
Absolutely, glad to be here.
Fantastic.
I was in the neighborhood.
Hey, how long have you been holding on to that one?
I just thought of it.
No way. Come on.
Yes, I did.
I'd have written that one down. All right. So we're here to talk about the book, The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers by Maxwell King. And we got this book Was it last year?
I believe it was last year.
Well,
no, it was the beginning of this.
I think it was last year.
Was it last year?
I think it was
last spring, I think.
Anyway, so last year, so at the School of Education here at the University of Mississippi, there's a book club that's been going on since before I came here.
Mm-hmm.
And KB Malier has been operating it since I've gotten here. And they select a book, and then they use it as an object of conversation over a semester. And this was a selection last year sometime, last academic year. And I got the book, you got the book, and wanted to talk about it. And I actually didn't get a chance to participate in the book club. So I've had the book and didn't necessarily read it at that time.
Right.
But we'll keep that between us.
Okay, I won't tell.
Then didn't get a chance to participate in the discussion because of classes or schedule. That's the excuse we'll go with. But saw that the movie was coming out.
Yes.
And I know you like Mr. Rogers a lot, and I thought, hey, why don't we read this book together and talk about it?
Absolutely.
Why Mr. Rogers?
Well, for me, as a child, I grew up and I watched Mr. Rogers. So he was on television doing new episodes when I was probably a wee bit older than his normal audience, I believe. And I didn't even know this, but after reading the book, that he stopped for a little while in the 1970s. And during that hiatus he had where he went and did some programming for adults and then later came back to the neighborhood, that was like the time where I would have been the perfect age for Mr. Rogers. But there were no new episodes. I think they were still airing reruns, I believe the book said. But regardless, I do remember watching Mr. Rogers as a child. And I liked it. I particularly loved when he would go and visit like a factory and show you how something was made. I particularly remember episodes where they made crayons. And graham crackers. I thought that was the bomb. My very, very favorite part of Mr. Rogers was not when he went to the land of make-believe, when Trolley went, but when he was in his kitchen and he got the figurines down that looked like the buildings and structures in the land of make-believe. And he didn't do that very often, but I just would hope every episode that he was going to take those down. I don't know why I like that. It was sort of the models of the land of make-believe that he had in his kitchen. He kept them like above the refrigerator or something. I don't know. I just remember, enjoying that. I watched some other, television for children probably more frequently than Mr. Rogers, but I did watch him. My real affinity for him came as an adult, and particularly as a parent when my son was watching. Our particular PBS station that we get, one of the stations we get, aired old Mr. Rogers episodes. By the time my child was watching, Mr. Rogers had died. Mm-hmm. But we still loved watching the episodes. And, of course, every time I watch an episode, I'd cry. So it's because the work that I do, the things that I like to talk about, and what's important to me as a teacher who teaches teachers is making sure that our teachers understand the importance of emotional and social development and the role that they play as a classroom teacher in that really important type of development. It's just what's important to me. The kids' emotional well-being is extremely important to me. The research that I do surrounds that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm particularly sensitive to those kinds of topics and the way that adults approach children. And when you watch Mr. Rogers as an adult, you pick up on things you do not, you see the reality of what he's doing and why he's doing it. And so every time I'd watch with my son, I would cry at the episodes. And so I even started writing. I was like, I need to write about this. I even started the opening of a manuscript where it's called Mr. Rogers Makes Me Cry. And then when we took up this book for the book club, I was like, I need to get back to that.
Yeah.
It's like it's been a year or so. I looked back, it had been like 7 years. I mean, time just that I had written that because I said my son's 4 now, and he's 12.
Yeah.
So it had been a while. But anyway, so we love Mr. Rogers. He's just one of my heroes. Just because I think what was important to him is what's important to me.
Yeah.
And I felt like he just got it. And was doing it.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, even just on a very surface level, when you're talking about going to the factory, mm-hmm. that's probably why they did that show, how things are made.
Yeah.
And they go in and they just show exactly like, wow, that's amazing. I mean, that's Mr. Rogers right there.
It's really neat. It's something you wonder about. It's something
How do they make toilet paper?
How do the graham crackers get in those little wax paper, containers.
That's
How,
right.
it's just really, there's so many Mr. Rogers episodes, and some of it I can't remember if it's, did I see that or was as a child, or was I watching that with my child? With my child.
Yeah, yeah.
Some of the ones I know distinctively, but just the way that he, approached children, the language he used, the way he used the language, and just to me the honest way in which he, thought about how children might be thinking about something, or what might be bothering them, and that, and as a teacher, we're doing that all the time. Thinking about what might a student, if I say this or if I say it this way, how might they take it? Might there be a misconception? Could I explain it better? Very careful language, and I think to some extent, some of his critics are, that was what they were critical of. But it's exactly what he was doing. It was so purposeful,
That's
and it's
right.
what made it so. It was so important to what he did. Was just the carefulness and the way he chose the language and how he chose to explain things, and the honest nature in which he did things and approached topics that were done in a different way on his show than they were done anywhere else.
And that's what I mean, and that's my appreciation coming out of the book. And just, we didn't watch Mr. Rogers all that much in my house, but I mean, obviously knew who he was and knew some of the things, but wasn't really a diehard watcher of Mr. Rogers. But then you look at just the memories I had and the things when I did watch, and looking at the intention that he designed into everything, and how we want that. I mean, you think about some of the most popular shows right now or something like that. You look at the intention and design and why they're doing what they did. Like, oh, that's so good and that's so good. When everything was painstakingly designed in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, where it was going in between make believe and his the neighborhood, right? And like how he thought about that and thought about those transitions and not wanting to confuse people, even when he had one of the famous, and there's a picture in the book, the famous episodes when he had the Wicked Witch of the West,
right?
Which probably represented fear for everyone.
For me, it did.
Yeah.
She freaked me out.
Yeah, everything.
And I loved that movie, but every time she came on the air, it made me so nervous.
Oh yeah, when she's in the tornado and she turns into the witch and is like, oh my gosh, and you probably think like, I mean, for me that movie was shown every Thanksgiving, right? Like the Wizard, it was probably shown every year, and it was an event because there's only 4 channels or whatever. And man, we sound old.
We are so old.
But watching that, the flying monkeys and the Wicked Witch of the West.
I remember when there were only 3 channels, Joel.
Oh wow!
Yes.
Wow, there's 33% more. It got better. But looking at that movie was like, when she turned into the witch or when the flying monkeys are happening, like that represented fear. And he's like, I'm going to see that. I'm going to take that apart. I'm going to show you the difference between real and fantasy and show how she just, is this nice lady all of a sudden like, wait, she's putting on this stuff. Now she's the Wicked Witch. And like, but just totally took that down and like addressed the fear of it.
Yeah. And it wasn't about that the movie's bad or it's bad to be scared. It's that it's okay to be scared if you know it's fun and it's make-believe and you're doing it for, but also to know that there's not magic behind everything, that it's, it's make-believe. And so we can control, we can decide, what, I need to remember that's just that real lady I know.
Right.
And so if it gets overwhelming for us, we have the ability to put it in perspective.
Yeah.
And he's giving that gift to the children, that this is what's really happening. It's fun to be scared, but sometimes it's not fun to be scared.
Right. Yeah.
What's the reality of it, and giving them control.
Yeah.
And I think, in life, children have very little control.
Yeah.
And they learn that they have more control than they thought. But the problem is that a lot of times they're powerless because of the adults. The adults around them have the power,
right.
And a lot of times the adults around them don't teach that they, how to teach children how to use their power, and so a lot of things are out of children's control. So I think he introduced ideas that were saying you have control, here's knowledge, here's how this works, going to the factory, this kind of thing. That's part of giving children, control back.
Yeah. Yeah, and even just looking at how they have some examples of how he responded to kids' questions with the letters in the back, and some were pretty pretty darn funny when,
Yeah.
you know, like the question's like, you know, never seen you poop,
Yeah,
Mr.
how do you
Rogers.
go to the bathroom?
Yeah,
I don't
like,
think you do.
Yeah, and like he's, you know, there's a little bit of difference between what you see on TV and my real life, but yeah. I do that. It's all good. All right, so excited to talk about this book. Want to get into the categories, want to honor your time, and but let's think about the first category, and it's the high five. So top, I sent you the categories, and I see you got notes. That's fantastic.
Yes.
And you've got some dog-eared pages as well, and I've got some Post-its, so we're good to go. So why don't you kick us off with what's one of your top learnings that you took from Mr. Rogers?
For me, from my
Yes.
perspective.
Yep, from your perspective.
What really struck me, and particularly one of my favorite parts of the book, and it's sprinkled throughout, but there was a thicker section of it, where they talk about his work with the Arsenal. And Dr.
The soccer
McFarland.
team?
No, not that one.
Okay, yeah.
This is the Child Development Center
Yes.
at the university itself.
And that was started by Spock, Dr. Spock.
Dr.
right?
Spock was one of the main,
famous.
right? And so Fred went to study there, and he studied under Dr. McFarland. I think it was Margaret McFarland.
Margaret
It's a
McFarland.
huge influence on him, and of course Dr. Spock was there, Benjamin Spock, and Eric Erickson would come, which was amazing. Which I was like, what?
Which we
'cause
teach
I
about.
just
We teach
teach-
about.
I was just teaching Erickson's 8 Stages of Man to my class. So, all these influential people, and then T. Barry Brazelton, which is who was one of my favorite people. Really, basically, sort of the very not exactly similar to Dr. Spock, but a respected pediatrician that had outreach and books and things that parents really held on to. And my mom was a big fan of Dr. Brazelton, and I was introduced to him as a child through her.
Wow.
About his work and the books that he wrote and those kinds of things. So, I thought that was really, really interesting. But one of the takeaways for me was this idea, and after reading, it's not like I didn't know, but I guess I didn't think about it, because I teach human development, I teach child development, and I teach these theories like Eric Erickson's 8 Stages of Man and Piaget and Vygotsky and all of these folks. And the book talks about how this the ways of thinking about early learning and child development are relatively new. And so it made me kind of think about, when I teach this to my students, and I talk about the importance of social and emotional development, particularly cognitive development, obviously, as teachers, but how you really can't separate social, emotional, cognitive development. They all go together.
Right.
And how they are also pioneers. It's that new. It's not been that long. I mean, here is Fred Rogers with Eric Erickson, at the Arsenal. And how, and the book just really, it kind of just slapped me in the face with it. It's not that I didn't know. It's not that I didn't know when Erickson was doing his work, or when Vygotsky wrote, and how long Piaget was around, and all that kind of stuff. I know this, but it just kind of hit me that the way that I feel is really important to think about how children learn in their emotional and social development is relatively new. It's not something that's been around a long time, And so it kind of, one of my high fives or my takeaways is this idea that I want my students to know that they can be pioneers in this area. When they go to their school and they say, wait a minute, we need to think about how we're doing this, or this really isn't developmentally appropriate, or this isn't the way children need to be introduced to this, or maybe we need to speak differently to the kids, or maybe this isn't a great practice, that they can be pioneers. It's that new in terms of science. I mean, it's not been that long. And there's still controversy around it. I mean, I've got pages in the book here, dog-eared, when I'm like, oh, that's just like the controversy around reading instruction, and how do we, how much of it is science and how much of it is the whole child, and how much of it is this, and about testing and all of these kinds of things. All of these things are still being talked about. How much importance do we place on cognitive development versus social and emotional development in school? Why are they separated?
Right.
Why do we focus on one more than the other? Those types of things, those are still things that are being talked about and discussed and challenged. And I want my students to feel like they're pioneers, that they can learn about this and they can go and make change like Fred Rogers did.
Right. Well, and the fact that he leaned on these people, and what was cool about the group of scientists that were here, and then with Fred Rogers, is that they were trying to create things that could get in the hands of the people that could use it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just on the ivory tower talking to each other,
Right.
but they thought about how do we, like Spock had the book, and then Fred Rogers has TV show, and McFarlane's offering advice, and you obviously got some things from your mom and Brazelton, is that what you said?
Seabury Brazelton.
And then so like that was important, right? That what they did wasn't just for their own knowledge or to share at conferences or just write paper. It was like, no, how do we get this into the hands of the people that need it?
Yeah. And Fred Rogers was pioneering what it looked like in media.
Yeah.
Right? What does this
yeah.
look like in television? What are these concepts and ideas about human development, emotional development, social development look like in TV land? I mean, what does it look like in
versus
terms of
economic
media?
development, which is
Correct,
what was
which is
happening.
what he was completely disgusted him.
Yeah.
So I think that purity of his mission, I think, is what really is really what makes him great. Is that the singular focus on this is important, and this is what it should look like in media, and this is how it should be, and that those exacting standards that the book talks about that he had are all part of that, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to do it right, if this is true about child development, then we have to do it right.
Right.
It's like if we don't, then we're ignoring what we know to be true. So it's this idea of either if you're going to do it the best, and if it's for kids, it better be the best.
It better be good. Yeah. Not gonna be. So mine kind of touches on that same thing. I was just this idea of starting with the child, and so, and this actually I just got back from a conference, and we kind of heard this a couple times where it was, we're talking about teaching or talking about analysis of, what the teacher's doing, but then it's like, but what does it mean for the student, right? What does it mean for the student? What does it mean for the child? And that's what, it seemed like that was his foot, like, what does this mean for the child? If we say this, how might a child take it up? And like, almost to a maddening sense when he's talking about, well, not maddening, but like when he's talking about when someone is like talking about how do you take something, a script, and translate it into Mr. Rogers' talk, like how many steps there were to that.
Right,
like there was many
I love
steps.
that part of the
Oh
book.
my gosh,
that's
it was
great.
yeah.
Where they took an example and walked it through his. They called it Freddy's, or he's talking about the language of
Freddish translation.
Yeah, Freddish.
Freddish translation.
I thought that was great.
Yeah. Yeah, to take something like it's dangerous to play in the street,
Yes.
and all the way to step 9 is, so your favorite grown-ups can tell you where it is safe to play. It is important to try to listen to them, and listening is an important part of growing.
Yes.
And that's the 9th step going
Yes,
through.
I love it. I love that.
But I mean, it was true. Like,
Yes.
all these steps that you had to go through, and like thinking about what might take place in the mind of a child.
Yes,
Right?
and that part of the book, Joel, is where I've got notes about this is what skilled teachers do. It's exactly what skilled teachers do. They worry about how do I say this? Is what I was mentioning before. How do I say it where there's no misconception? How do I clear up misconceptions?
Right.
And so when they took this piece through, this is we have to think about this. We have to think about this, and then even part of it. There's I don't know if you're familiar with conscious discipline. It's a approach
A little bit, yeah.
by Becky Bailey. And so this whole idea about rephrase your new statement, repeating step 1, good, as a personal value judgment. So you don't want to put that in there. You want to say your favorite grown-up can tell you where it is safe to play. It is important to try to listen to them. Instead of it's good to listen to them, take out the good. It's a value judgment.
Right.
That's such a conscious discipline approach.
Yeah.
Is what Becky Bailey would say. Why do you need to pass judgment? Just say what it is that what it is you want them to do. That it's important.
Right.
So I was like, that's Becky Bailey's conscious discipline. I mean, it's all. He was teaching. Obviously, he taught. I think he was a teacher in a certain kind of way for sure.
Yeah.
But the way he approached it is the way good teaching is what good teaching looks like.
Yeah, and so I had some other, like, just how the perception, and again, for those that the book, I would highly recommend picking it up, but, like, the anxiety of a haircut, and thinking about that, or, his famous song, What Do You Do With the Mad That You Feel, like, I'm just thinking.
When you feel so mad you could bite, I feel like that a lot.
Yeah.
Chill.
Well, exactly, I mean, and exactly, like, to that sort of thing. I mean, I even just had an exchange with my son this morning, and he's trying to get this toy separated, and probably had a lot of things. This is one of his favorite things, and he couldn't. And I'm like, we got to get to school, but this thing is like he thinks it's broken, and it's this one of his favorite things that he has, and like, I didn't honor that in that moment, right? I didn't honor that, like those feelings and like the anxiety and the fear that his favorite toy might be broken, and just saying, like, hey, we got to hustle and get to the car, and like, Mr. Roger wouldn't do that. And then one of the heartbreaking stories, well, not heartbreaking, I mean, just that shows the kind of guy he was. Somebody walks up to him in a restaurant, a little boy walks up to the restaurant, barely can see the top of the table, and comes up to Mr. Rogers and just said, my puppy died. And like, what does he do? He gets down, gets with him, and just starts talking about death with the puppy in the middle of this restaurant.
Yeah.
And just, that was just amazing. And the fact, too, that it wasn't just he had some ideas and put those ideas into play on a TV show, and he was very meticulous. No, he's put these ideas into play, but he also studied, right? He also checked with Dr. McFarland and bounced it because he wanted to do things right, and he wanted to make sure, if we're looking at something from a developmental perspective, whatever we know now, because again, they were on cutting edge of development with some of the big minds that they had at the Arsenal Center. And how do we do this right is what I'm saying, correct, for lack of a better term. Like, how can we make this the best way to approach this topic, whatever it is, because he tackled some tough topics. How is what we're doing as appropriate as it can be? Right. And that's what he did. So mine, I'll go with one. So, and this is an easy one. Action. Oh, I'll do it. I'm going to do a second one. Okay, sorry, I got a second one, too. Yeah, a second one. Yeah. So we're going to get to 5 eventually.
Okay, I have 2.
I bet.
But I could come up with
I've got 3.
50, but I wrote down 2. Okay.
Well, I had this set up as a quote to mention. Oh, shoot. Darn it. It's about making choices. Oh. Darn it.
Is it my number 2?
Is it your number 2? Oh, yeah.
That's my number 2.
Do that.
Do we have the same one?
No.
Okay, so my number 2 takeaway for the high five is, and it comes from this quote. It says, you rarely have time, this is a Fred Rogers quote, you rarely have time for everything you want in this life, so you need to make choices. And hopefully your choices can come from a deep sense of who you are. And so my takeaway from this, that really spoke to me. And my takeaway is that I need to focus most on the change that I hope to make in teachers. And obviously that's something it's important to me, but a lot of other things get in the way of that. Other work commitments, responsibilities, etc. And so I felt like that's a message for me to take away, that I need to focus my efforts on what I feel is lacking in schools and what I feel are the most pressing needs for students. And for me, that's social and emotional support from everyone in the school setting, not just teachers, but teachers, personnel, administrators, bus drivers, cafeteria workers. I have a really strong opinions about how our schools are not meeting the social and emotional needs of our children. For the most part, they're not. Yeah. And I walk into schools and I see things constantly. I'm turning left and I'm turning right, and I see things that just should not be happening. And it's things that are under the control of the adults in the school, the way the kids are talked to, the way they're managed in school, the way they're overly controlled, the focus on things that aren't as important as the focus on that they should be focusing on, the emotional and social support they're getting or not getting. And so it just made me think, here's this thing that I'm really passionate about and I do work on, but I don't spend the majority of my time anymore working on that, and I think that makes me sad. So, it's kind of like a wake-up call. That quote, right. That's what I took from it. Yeah. And I took from it more from a professional perspective, not necessarily a personal perspective. But I think you can look at it from a personal perspective as well. But I tend to do what I want. Personal. I don't have there are other things I'd like to do more often, but that really spoke to me in a professional way. Yeah. Where I feel like a lot of times I should be making a more concerted effort to get back to what I'm really passionate about in my work.
And that is, I mean, that is one thing that's about this job of being a professor, and you have all these different avenues, and sometimes without meaning to, you can get pushed off into certain directions and things and whatnot. And
yeah. I mean, you want to be helpful. You want to do, your job well, and so you get distracted, I guess. And so it just sort of was a message to me to, get back to what I'm interested in.
I was actually going to use that quote to open up the high five, just saying there's lots of choices that we only have so much time for the podcast. Good thing I didn't do that, because that just would have stolen your thunder.
That would have taken my second high five, yeah.
And that would have been probably some anger coming from your side. Anyway, probably not. All right.
No biting, I promise.
What do you do with the mad you feel? All right. Well, that gets tied in with my second learning, was that actions are greater than words. And I mean, and you just saw that over and over, like the amount of stories that he had, and just while people didn't believe that Fred Rogers was real. I mean, I want to say Mr. Rogers because that's a character, but it actually wasn't really. I mean, it was like who he was.
That's what everyone said, right? In the book, there's not a difference,
right?
Yeah,
and people were like, "This, he can't be real." Like, what's and like all the stories about who he really was, and like all these rumors about, and like none of them were true. It's just like, because people just couldn't believe that there was someone that, and he's a big man of faith, and he looked to see how those lessons that he saw in faith could actually come to play in his work, and you saw this continuity. There's a it's a misquote, but there's a quote out there from St. Francis of Assisi that you should preach the gospel in everything you do, and if necessary, use words. It's a misquote, but anyway, but the intent behind
good idea,
it,
though,
it's a good idea, but the intent is kind of like what Mr. Rogers is doing in his work, is he's showing these actions, and he saw some people doing that same thing. Like one of his teachers from seminary would always show up without a coat in the wintertime because he would give it away, right? He would give it away, and and even thinking, going into, he was Mr. Rogers was a Christian, but he looked into all sorts of faiths, but I mean, he primarily identified as a Christian. And you look at some of the teachings of Christ, and he talks about like the importance of children, and it's like it almost made sense that, oh well, obviously if you're going to deal with it, I'm going to deal with the youngest children, because those are the ones that Jesus showed honor to in situations where they weren't normally honored, right? And even thinking about his own childhood, where he was brought up in a place where during a time when children were better seen and not heard, but yet in his family you kind of saw this sort of honoring of ideas and creativity. And I mean, even like when the story of him purchasing the piano,
his grandmother sending him down.
Yeah.
He picked it out.
Like this kid coming in and
he comes back with the money.
Coming in with I'll take that Steinway and I'll be back with a check. And like, wow, like Mr. Rogers. There
I
you
love
go.
that story.
Yeah.
No, and that I think kind of off of what you said, and part of I remember reading this, and maybe it was one of those, like you said, urban myths about Mr. Rogers, but I feel like I read it, and it makes more sense than like he was a Navy SEAL or whatever. But that he was really interested in Buddhism. I think he was interested in all religions based on the book. He was obviously a Presbyterian minister, but he had interest in, he had books, they said, next to his bedside table about all religions. And I'm pretty sure he had an interest in Buddhism from something else I'd read. But I think the strand, and this word was only mentioned once in the book, but everything spoke around this. It's the same idea. So it's the idea of compassion. So it's a Buddhist. It's one of the Buddhist teachings that life is suffering, and I believe that there was one section, I can't remember exactly. There's a quote from Mr. Rogers about pain. I can't remember, about life is painful, something like that. So it's this idea that life is suffering. I mean, it's kind of an odd idea. Yeah. And that compassion is important. That's a Buddhist, teaching. And this idea of compassion for others' humanity. And in the book, they talked about how, obviously, Fred Rogers was really, religious person and faithful to his religion and all of that. And I think it was him that said, there's a whole section about him saying about kind of pointing out that Jesus was a human.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this idea
it's
about
humanity.
it's humanity that, that Fred, I think, connected with.
Yeah.
And so, when you think about someone's humanity, and if humanity is pain or is suffering, then what you do to alleviate that pain is compassion. That's you showing compassion. And I think that's at the heart of what Fred Rogers was all about, was compassion, right? Compassion for everyone, but particularly for children. Mm-hmm. And if you think about where are children, what are they thinking, what are they fearing? This is all from a place of compassion.
Right.
And that word was used once, but but everything else that was said really is the same thing. Yeah. But that's, and I just read somewhere that he was interested in Buddhism and the teachings and all of that. And I have to think that's true after reading this. I don't know where I read that. Yeah. But that word, I think is, speaks to who he was.
Well, even thinking, so at School of Ed, we have our undergrads, and they create a portfolio that they're all love doing. And one of the things that we have in the portfolio is this philosophy statement. Now they create this longer paper that they condense down into what I like to say is a pocket-sized version of a philosophy statement that, something you could take with you that you can, for me, I like to lead people to love others through teaching. That's my thing. So if I take that with me and then think about how do I make decisions based off of that. And I think you see that with Fred Rogers in that he looks at a situation and kid comes up, says my puppy died. What does he do? Like in a split second, he's on the floor talking to the kid because it was about compassion. It was about showing love to this kid, about honoring their fears and their questions, and and you think about all these sorts of stories that are in the book where it's these scenarios, these real life scenarios. You see how he acted out his philosophy, and you see what he stands for and what he does. And it was basically that I'm going to take this thing that I believe and I'm going to make it come to life. Right? Mm-hmm. You're going to see it in my actions, and I'm going to try to avoid being a hypocrite. And I love it. In one of the episodes, they talk about Santa, and they talk about good. But the quote in there was, good people aren't good all the time. They're just trying to be, right? Yeah. And it's like
that was a Daniel Tiger.
Yeah.
Right. Then Daniel Tiger was concerned about Santa Claus coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And which, again, speaking to fears, right?
Right.
But thinking, you have this thing, you have this flaw, and you're going to try to live it out on a day-to-day basis. You're going to see that through your actions. And I just wish, more often, people would. Well, I'll put it on myself. I wish I more often would take the time and think about my actions and try to make sure I'm aligning it to these things I profess about myself, or just that maybe I don't have to profess it, that just my actions will speak out to it. Mm-hmm. So I just love that. Over and over again I was underlining stuff like action, action. But then again, you saw it with his family and the people that he surrounded himself with. They were doing the same things, and like his grandfather, he was playing on the wall, and I think his mom wanted him to get down because he thought he'd get hurt. Like, no, let him climb the wall. Yeah. Let him explore. Yeah. Right? And you saw,
that was really big to him.
Yeah.
That's another thing. You don't know. As adults, you never know things, what's big and important to a child. We make assumptions of what we think is big and important to an adult. That's not the same thing as what's big and important to a child.
Right.
Like that little statement made a huge impact on him.
Yeah.
And he was talking about it later in his 70s. It's just like, those things that, why would a kid be afraid of that? They'll get over it. Those little things that they're bigger, they're magnified.
Right.
When you're powerless, when you're, vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he had a gift certainly to see something from a perspective for a child's perspective. And I think it was mentioned over and over in the book, but he even said it, that the ability to do that is because you remember what it was like to be, that you put I think he said something about, if we think about the child in us or who we were as a child, it's, it gives you perspective in what children must be thinking. You have to remember yourself as a child.
Yeah. And, like, to exercise, I mean, so he obviously wasn't perfect. And you think, like, his development of this empathy muscle was, I mean, he had a pretty big empathy muscle towards the end. But, like, I mean, well, you'd think, obviously he would, because he practiced it. He'd, like,
Right.
and, like, how do we all practice building up our empathy muscles?
And I think to some extent, he's lucky. He was born into a family that nurtured empathy's taught. I mean, that research tells us that, right? Yeah. And so, you know, he obviously had a healthy dose of it, of learning about empathy as a child. But like you said, then in life, what he did was through action. Yeah. He exercised it over and over and over again.
And kept in touch with it, All right, so you're tapped out. But
I got my high fives
there you go. So I got one more.
Yep.
And this one's fairly easy. Slow down. He never, he wouldn't rush to push something out, right? And so, I mean, there's many, many instances of that. I mean, his education, like he switched schools and just knowing that he would find a better fit somewhere else for his undergraduate. And then even just the pace of his program, everything else was frantic. He would slow it down even more when he got into the second iteration of it, just as, you know, storylines would get, you know, lengthened a little bit.
It took a whole week to do a theme, those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, versus everything else was, you know, and they did some contrast with how Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was different from Sesame Street and, like, the frantic pace and, like, but even Sesame Street figured it out when they created Elmo's World. We needed to create a space where it was slowed down a little bit, and just thinking about the importance of that, and even when he was addressing adults, and like the famous video or the famous testimony that he had in front of Congress that fought for the original funding for public television with Pastore, and they do a decent amount of description of it in the book, and actually found the video on YouTube.
Yeah, I've seen that video.
So I post.
It's kind of unbelievable.
Yeah, it is, and it'll be in the show notes. I'm going to embed it in the show notes, and the pace that he addresses the Senator Pastore, and how it's just like, oh, you're in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. You're sitting on the couch with him, and he's just addressing the Senate from that same perspective. He didn't need to change who he was. He didn't need to change his pace. He didn't need to do anything, and even recited the words to "What Do You Do with the Mad You Feel" song.
That's right. Yeah.
And you see it, and, like, it doesn't have to be a million miles an hour. And I think we're all figuring that out eventually. Like slow is better. Slowing it down and really putting thought into things, and even, you know, do I have to? Is my class going to be better if I do 7 things versus if I 7 things really fast, or if I do 2 things really well? Probably the 2 is probably going to be better, right? And to really
that goes back to the choices thing we said earlier,
right?
Right?
Yeah.
If you make choice, by making choices, you're selecting, right? And by selecting, you're pruning.
Right.
So, in essence, it slows you down. You're not doing so many things. But
yeah, it got me thinking a lot, that whole slowing down part. So anyway, those are high five. So now we got imagine this, or no, sorry.
Now you know.
Now you know. So what would you do now, given this learning? Now, I know you've known about Mr. Rogers for a while, but maybe if there's something new that you took out of this, or something that from the ahas that you drew out from the high five, or...
And what my now you know comes from my high five.
Awesome. Very good.
So it's mine. I would focus more on my interest in social and emotional development in the school setting. Spend more time working with pre-service and in-service teachers and creating safe and healthy spaces at school for children.
Wow.
So that's what I would have done, and what I'm going to do.
There you go.
Because it goes off of that high five about making choices, focusing on what's important to me and where I feel I can make the most impact in terms of children. I'm a teacher, so the reason I have this job while I'm teaching adults now, I'm doing it because I care about kids. Mm-hmm. When I say kids, I mean pre-K through. Right. To me, for elementary, pre-K through whatever. But I call college kids now, but and I care about them too. But the reason I do this job is for my concern about elementary school children, period. Mm-hmm. And so, I need to put my efforts there. And so, what would I have done differently if I had read the book sooner? I think make that switch.
Yeah.
Or make that. I guess it's not really a switch because I was doing it, but focus on it more and really do more with it.
Put that at the center.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that, and seeing what he was able to accomplish with that kind of vision and making those choices and not doing. I mean, he did have that hiatus point, but then he went back and focused in on his wheelhouse, right? And in the book somewhere, there's a quotation above like using gifts, and it's using gifts that you have to serve others, really.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I focused in on. There's a verse in the Bible that's on that, but I mean, it's not that out of the ordinary, but it's using the gifts you've been given to serve others. And I think that's at that center. It kind of gets at what you're saying too, is like, how have you been shaped? What are you passionate about? Like, there's a reason for that. And like, now how do you focus in on it? And that's, I mean, it's kind of unique that, I mean, he kind of had this vision from the get-go that he wanted to help children. Like, and he had music and puppets and like, I'm going to use all these gifts to do
Put it all together.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about Now You Know, is having a vision, and it took me a while to get to this idea of like, what do I, to articulate it and to what I really stand for, but then also to lean on the experts to do that vision. Like, again, he wasn't someone who went on his own. I mean, he had an idea of what he wanted to do, but he still collected the ideas of experts to reinforce where he was going, right? And I mean, some of the greatest experts in the world on the things that he wanted to talk about. So it's kind of a nice thing there. But to do that for myself, right, is to what do the experts have to say on how to get this done, and not just think because I have just because you have a vision doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to execute it well. That you do need to lean on others, that other people that have done things or have ideas about how to do things better. So that's what I would do. All right, scenario. So this is an imagine this situation. So I have a scenario that you could help me with, or if you have your own scenario. No,
I came thinking you were going to throw a scenario at me.
Well, so it's one thing where I just wonder how Mr. Rogers, and maybe you'd know. Again, I didn't watch him as much as you did. Like, I have a child who's and I had the same fear when I was a kid. That's afraid of the dark. And like,
I still am. To some extent.
You want me to? It's getting darker. It's
really
we should turn the light on. So how would, or even too this morning when I was talking about the stuck toy, but let's just go with afraid of the dark. Like, taking the learning, like, how would we respond to a child that's afraid of the dark? And I might actually use this tonight, so help me out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first inclination is to listen. And I think that's one of the things you learn from this book is how important it is just to listen. Tell me more about that. A lot of times I think as adults we put ideas into kids' minds like, you say, what do you want for dinner tonight? By the time they even have a chance to answer, you're like, pizza? You it's like a bombardment. Right. And I think this whole idea about Fred Rogers giving space and time and pauses and all these things that were weird on television. Yeah. A lot of that is, obviously time to let a child think. And then for us, we have to give time to listen. So, what is it what is it about the dark that scares you? What is it that you're, why do you feel, what is it that makes you afraid? What are you afraid of? It's just this idea of listening. And so listening obviously gets you information so that you can take action on it, kind of an understanding. But it also sends a message. So if you listen to a child and you give them time and you ask them questions without, I think as adults we're constantly trying to direct children.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of directing and manipulating and controlling adults have over children all the time,
Yeah.
which is not a good thing. I think the listening not only gives you the information you need from the child, but sends the message that I care about what you're saying, and what you're saying is important and valuable and not weird or not different or not wrong. You know, that I'm interested, you know, and so you're valued.
Right.
So I think listening would be first steps to me, and I think that's from the book. You know, how would you respond to the scenario? What from learnings from the book is listening, and then asking questions, listening more, and then I think, and we talk about this in teaching all the time with kids, but acknowledging their fear. I am really, you know, I understand why that makes sense. Why you're scared. Kind of an acknowledgement that it's okay to be scared, that it's not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you really shouldn't worry about that. You know, that's a terrible thing to say.
I think I might have said that.
And it's we do it out of, we're trying to help.
Trying to get them to bed.
Yeah, or trying to give ourselves a break. You know, it's frustrating. It's hard work.
Yeah.
But, you know, acknowledging, I understand you're scared. I'm really sorry about that. You know, and also then empathizing. I've been scared of things too, even if it's not the dark.
Right.
You know, or I've been scared of the dark too.
Mm-hmm.
And here's something that's helped me. Or, you know, and then talking about the things that they told you. I know the part to go from there is just depends on what they said.
Right.
You know, it's very situational to some extent, but I think this acknowledging that you're there to listening, and then empathizing and saying, I'm really sorry that you're scared. That must be terrible.
Yeah.
You know, and then, you know, I've been scared before. Here's some, you know, this has helped me. Do you think it might help you?
Right.
And then giving some tools.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they don't have all the tools. And we don't have all the tools, but we may have something that we've used that has been helpful. And then also saying, you know, if you know, next time you get scared, it's okay to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay to be scared.
Right.
You know, but think about something you could do to help yourself. You know, giving them a tool that helps them, giving them power.
Yeah.
But and I think I'm sure Fred Rogers would have a much better answer than me. But I think first he'd listen.
Well, and I think so now, and just thinking as you're talking, I'm also thinking about other fear. Like I teach teachers how to teach math, right? Mm-hmm. And so thinking about there's fear in math classrooms, mm-hmm. and to think why that fear exists, or just even to think, you know, I'm afraid to give an answer that might be wrong, right? Or just afraid to put my thinking out there. And I know we've talked a little bit about the productive struggle, right? We want to promote productive struggle, but that also means showing some weakness or showing some vulnerability, a better word, in their responses, and thinking like, you know, how do I listen? Right? How do I understand their perspective? How do I see where they came from?
Give them time.
Give them time. Honor what they have to say. I mean,
slow down. All those things we've been saying.
Exactly.
You know, and like you said with your son, you know, you're in a hurry. I think you were trying to go somewhere with a toy or something like that. I mean, those things happen. We don't always have, but you know, maybe we have more time than we think.
We probably had more time. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm the world's worst on rushing. So, because I have to be on time. And so that's a huge lesson for me. Is you know, maybe there's more breathing room in every aspect of life than we acknowledge.
Well, in a book that I did on the podcast like 2 podcasts ago, was Magdalene Lampert's book, and Teaching with Problems and the Problems of Teaching. And for her class, she does one problem. Mm-hmm. One problem. Which they do the whole class period, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. But they really take their time, and it's really about listening to each other, responding, and trying to understand people's thinking, even if it's, quote unquote, wrong, like to understand what the thinking is, because the thinking still has value to lead you towards the correct answer, right? That we are all in this together to figure it out, and we need to understand each other. And wouldn't that be great to do that in all sorts of scenarios, right? Mm-hmm. Not just in a child's class, not just in thinking about being afraid of the dark, but there's lots of other venues where that sort of thinking would be helpful. as well. All right, so that's the scenario. How about some for a 7-year-old? How'd you do there?
This was hard. I don't know why this was so hard, because you think it's so simple. So what's the lesson? It says, how would you explain the point of this book to a 7-year-old?
That's right.
I mean, what's the point of the book? I mean, I think it depends on what you get from it. But I think, to a 7-year-old, the point of the book is that you're fine just the way you are, just like Fred Rogers would say. And that...
I was looking for a quote, too. I was like, there's got to be... He said it somewhere.
I like you just the way you are, is what he says, And I think that's the message, is that everyone's fine the way they are. It's a message of acceptance. And I think that's the message of the book, is, accepting others but most importantly, accepting yourself. And I think there's a quote in there where he talks about you cannot love others unless you love yourself.
Right.
So it starts with accepting that you're fine the way you are. So I think that's the lesson to a 7-year-old. The issue, I think the reason I had an issue with this question is summing up something like that to a child it's good for them to hear, but it gets driven home through action, like you said.
Yeah.
It's about the actions you take with that child, the listening that you do.
Yeah.
Demonstrates that you feel that they're important and that they're great just the way they are.
Yeah.
The way that you talk with them. So yes, and it's important that they hear it, and that's why Fred Rogers started and ended his show the same way. Wow. That's why it's important for them to hear it. Yes, hear it, but it's about action and about how they see the adults interacting with them on a daily basis. Right. And it's that constant action that you talked about over and over and over again. And it's done in many, many different ways, but it's the same message.
Right.
It's the listening. It's the wow, or it's the marveling in an accomplishment, or allowing a child to do something their way, or try something out without correction all the time, or listening intently, and all of those things that you do that are important, that send that message. So I think it's hard to sum something up to a child. You can say it, but I think that I'm not sure they get the message until the action's been taken.
Yeah, to kneel down and tell my son, you're fine just the way you are, but I'm scared. No, get in that room.
Right, that's right. It's bedtime.
It's bedtime. No,
So it's just repeated.
Yeah.
It's about repeated action. So the message is there, but
you need the action.
You've got to have the action in order for it to work, to sink into a 7-year-old. For anyone really, but.
That's pretty good. I'm just gonna go with that one. I offered up a new category, and was it?
I have yes, I have many answers.
Okay, so yeah,
it's hard to narrow.
So I wanted to quote, and just the book is full of quotes, and I said I was thinking of best quote, but I can't remember how did I phrase it for you?
It was
a quote to carry with you. There you go.
One quote that stands out to you that may help you guide future teaching actions. Oh, there's so many, Joel.
All right, well, I want to just give me something.
Okay, so the first one, and this was actually not in the book, and I know this quote, so I was looking for it, but it wasn't in the book. But I'm going to use it anyway because I have other ones from the book.
No, that's good.
Okay, so this one, and it's really it's the second sentence of the quote that's my favorite, but I'll read the whole quote. It's a Fred Rogers, obviously, quote. If you could only sense how important you are to the lives of those you meet, how important you can be to the people you may never even dream of, there is something of yourself that you leave at every meeting with another person.
Wow.
And for me, as a teacher, that's the essence of teaching. What am I leaving every day with my students? And what I say and what I do and my enthusiasm, my passion, I think that's really, really important. So that's my favorite Fred Rogers quote. There's something of yourself that you leave at every meeting with another person. Sometimes that something's not great.
Yeah.
Sometimes that something's great. So obviously, the important thing is to make the not so great ones less,
right,
and the great ones more. And Another quote, because I couldn't decide, and this one's just really important to me. We've touched on this before.
Oh, yeah.
Is I think, and this is a Fred Rogers quote, I think of discipline as the continual, everyday process of helping a child learn self-discipline. So this is just strikes me because of my sensitivity to how I feel like adults just try to control children, and it's not because they're mean.
Right.
It's because they think that's what they're supposed to do. It's their job. It's the way they're supposed to guide, and if you don't, and if you're not punitive enough, or if you're not this enough, or harsh enough, or strict enough, then you're doing a disservice to children. So people actually think, and it comes from our puritanical roots, Joel, I could go on about this, in our country, but we're a punitive society, and it does not serve us well. And it carries over to children. It's this whole idea that I started off with saying that, I had this realization that my students can be pioneers in the field of social and emotional development because there's so much going on that's not good, that does not follow what research is showing us, because that area is new, relatively new, right? The late 1800s, the late 19th century and the 20th century is really when it started picking up. So we have a lot in our society that's just not healthy. It's not good for kids. And this whole idea around having a punitive society and all that kind of thing. Kids need structure, and they need discipline, but the way they need discipline is through self-discipline, is teaching self-discipline. And so I think that quote's really important, and I'll say it again. I think of discipline as the continual everyday process of helping a child learn self-discipline.
Yeah.
It's the teaching them how to control themselves, which is so important.
Right.
Instead of that control layer of being punitive, which is not helpful. So that's really important
to me.
to me.
And at an institution of higher learning where all of a sudden people might be out from under that control, some things happen sometimes, and where you even think, like, how does a child respond to freedom? And I think of, my own background. I was a teenager. Like, I didn't have a lot of rules, right? But my dad saw that I was... And mom saw that I was making good choices, getting good grades, doing well, and active, and like, okay, so why we don't need to control, like he's doing well, like and making good decisions, but also giving, like, so then translating that, so how do I, think about my own kids or working with teachers, and how do we allow them to open up freedom within the classroom for kids to make choices and kids to experience things, and helping them make better decisions, but not making those decisions for them.
Right. Yeah. It's harder to do. It takes more time, patience, thoughtfulness, but it works.
Well, yeah, and I like to use
positive.
I like to use small groups when I teach, or having kids work together, and it's hard. Like, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes they copy. Sometimes there's fighting, and sometimes it's like. But if you're going to have this potential for good and potential for teaching kids to work together, you're going to also have the potential for some bad things to go on. And just because some bad things happen, Fred Rogers falling off the rock wall, like, that could have happened, probably did happen, and he got hurt. Well, he had some consequence, and they like, okay, I'm going to figure out how to manage this thing on my own and not being told, just to completely avoid something.
Right.
And rather than I can offer some discipline for myself.
I have one last one.
Oh, another one.
And this one is in the context in the book where I think Dr. McFarland had brought in the center where young children were, the actual early childhood learning part of the center where the young children were at the preschool setting, and she brought in the sculptor who was working with clay.
Oh, yeah.
And she just wanted him to go in and, what did she say, love your clay?
Love your clay, yeah.
Like, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to teach anything, just go in and in the middle of them, do your art, right? And so she, I think that's really, really important. And so the quote is, like most good things, teaching has to do with honesty.
Right.
And so I think to me, that stood out. And it's about, that honesty can come in several forms, obviously, about being open and honest with kids and all the things we talked about how you talk with them about subjects that are hard to talk about.
Right.
And I could go on about the quotes, like, what's mentionable is manageable. So such a great quote. Yeah. And I think that was Dr. McFarland. Yeah. Where he got that from Dr. McFarland. What's mentionable is manageable, and if you can talk about it, we can work it out. I think that's huge. But this whole idea about honesty, that obviously lends itself to honesty. But this idea that being honest about what you're excited about, your passion, right? That artist was in the middle of the children being honest about his work.
Yeah.
You know, and that they see that. That all they had to do was see it.
Right.
And they might come and ask about it. They might, but it's this idea of exposing them to honest work and honest passion, and so I just love that. Like most good things, teaching has to do with honesty.
That's like, I mean, I've done this many times where like I'll be volunteering or somewhere with a bunch of kids, and like I like to color with crayons. I really like a good sharp crayon, you know, love it. And so if I just grab some paper, get to the middle of the floor, and this I've done this in other countries too. Just get on the floor and just start coloring. It's just
They come.
They come. They come. What are you drawing? I'm like, I'm drawing a puppy. I'm drawing a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. I can draw a mean Teenage Mutant Ninja
Nice.
Turtle. Yeah.
Yes.
And so, and they just also, and because that's infectious, like the passion for something. And I can't imagine this artist that's doing these awesome things with clay probably inspired some more artists. You know, maybe not necessarily with clay, but just to get excited about that. And they probably remember those moments of seeing this, you know, amazing artist doing their thing. And just, you know, if you have a passion, like to share it with somebody, or just to, you know, expose it to the kids, you know, or even, you know, doing some math problems and just asking kids about how they do certain things, how they put things together. I just go in and I'm just curious about how they solve problems.
But curiosity shows your passion, right?
That's
I mean, there's
right.
lots of ways to show enthusiasm and passion about work. Curiosity's one. Asking questions.
Right.
Showing enjoyment while you're doing. You know, all those kinds of things are really, really
Or
important.
just even talking about the books you're reading, like we're doing here.
Yeah.
I mean, and like getting excited about reading or characters, and like then they want to share something that they're doing. And it just builds on each other. But my quote came from, just because I've got two boys, and I'm raising, you have a boy too, and it was just thinking about this idea of like being strong, and not this, not that my daughter can't be strong, but just this idea about being strong,
Right.
And what is strong? When I was a boy, I used to think that strong meant having big muscles, great physical power, but the longer I lived, the more I realized that real strength has much more to do with what is not seen. Real strength has to do with helping others. And again, it's going back to this idea of action. But what do you do with strength? And there's a point made earlier in the book. I mean, and Fred Rogers grew up with a lot of wealth and a lot of privilege, and like just that he could have made a lot other choices with how he lived. He could have made a lot other choices with what he did later on in life. And like, you know, like he, you know, yeah, waving goodbye as Mr. Rogers, go and get into his, you know, Lamborghini. That'd be fun. That'd be great.
You'd love that one.
Yeah. No, but just seeing what he did and how he expressed strength, and even thinking about what was strong for him. You think about how strong he was to live out his philosophy in action, right? How strong he was, like he had a principle, like he was not ever going to market to kids, never going to market to kids, right? And he lived. I mean, think about how much more money could have been poured his way if he would have just said yes to any of those things, you know, or like what he was going to do with. Would ratings improve if he would have done X, Y, and Z with, you know, fast cuts, more like or like Sesame Street or something like that? But he had so much. His strength was something that he did because he knew that wasn't going to be as helpful to kids if he made those moves, and just the strength it would take to do that had nothing to do with muscles. It had something to do with principles and his and the actions that he did based off those principles.
Well, and then in the book, everyone talked about how they used the word powerful. How powerful he was.
Yeah.
Here's this person that's a slight built man,
143 pounds in his entire
soft
life.
speaking. You know, that's crazy. You know, soft spoken. His pace of speech was slow.
Yeah.
Yet one of the most they kept over and over. You heard it from so many different people. One of the most powerful people they've ever met.
Right.
You know, and like where does that power come from?
Exactly. So, I guess the power is, I mean, the fact that Maxwell King made the decision to, you know, or kind of made a push for capturing Fred Rogers' story and putting it in this book, and just the fact that we get an opportunity to share it, because there is something about a legacy and like how do we keep perpetuating it. And I hope that other people pick up this book, and just that the Fred Rogers Center that's putting out more media, and you can look at and see what other shows are out there that have his influence. Daniel Tiger, its neighborhood,
that's right,
is out there, and just other things that we can do to perpetuate his legacy. Because as we documented, there's many things we've learned from this book, and many things that we said, but many things that we left unsaid. And just knowing that he's got that movie coming out, or there's the movie coming out that can do more to share his story, but just that, the life and work of Fred Rogers is pretty amazing. And so thank you, Ann, for being willing to come on and share.
Thank you.
With the audience.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Wow, that was good. And conversations like that are exactly why I started this podcast, because I get to talk to someone like Dr. Monroe, and my friend. I get to hear her passion. I get to hear it on a fairly regular basis. But the fact that, one, she's willing to sit down with an hour and talk to me about Fred Rogers, which I know she has a lot of passion about, but just what's the excuse to do it, right? And so here's an excuse. We're going to do a podcast episode. So I get the excuse. I get the privilege of getting to sit down with her for an hour, and I get the opportunity to share it with you all. I think that's a win-win. That's the definition of a win-win. And one thing that I wanted to share with you, and which is kind of disconnected from the content, but I read it somewhere about this idea of a duo, right? Of having these duos of someone, a partner, and so you might call it a partner in crime, or someone that you work together really well. And it's someone that's good to bounce ideas off of. So like when I was bounce ideas off of, or to produce good stuff, good work, right? So when I was teaching at Sauk Prairie High School, my duo was Shane Bean. He's assistant principal now, but we started teaching together, and I would have all these crazy ideas about how to improve my classroom. I'd say, hey, Shane, I'm going to go do this. And he'd say, yeah, go do it. I'm like, you want to do it with me? He's like, no, but tell me how it goes. And so I'd go do it, and I'm like, oh man, it was awful, but I have an idea of how to change it to make it better. I'm like, you want to do it? And he's like, no, but you do it and tell me how it goes. And it was like that over and over again. And eventually, if I'd do something, I'd get it good, and then he would take it up in a little slower pace, but was someone that I could always go to and ask an opinion, a critical friend, if you will. And so when I left Sauk Prairie High School, I didn't leave Shane, because Shane and I still talk every week, every Thursday now. But we used to meet together for breakfast all the time. But we still talk. But it's still that day-to-day person that you can talk to, or someone that you work fairly closely with and do some projects. And Ann Monroe, Dr. Monroe, is someone that I work really well with together. So if there's projects, if we're thinking about how to improve a class, or we've done a few large-scale projects together, done some presentations together, and it works. Like she offers different points of view and stuff that just works well together. And the reason why I'm sharing these examples of Dr. Monroe and Shane Bean is, if you're a teacher, you're someone that's teaching, or even whatever, you're parenting, right? It's good to have a duo. It's good to have a Robin to your Batman, or a Batman to your Robin, however you want to put that. It's good to have that partner that you can work well together, that you're always improving each other. It's like one's climbing up, the other one, and then you bring the other one with you, and then they climb up past you, they bring you with, and you're just working together. It's like, it's this elevator going up together, and it works better. We work better together. And I just hope that you have folks in your life like a Shane Bean, like an Ann Monroe, who you get to work with, so that you get better at teaching others. Because it's also good to have that person when there's frustrations or there's challenges to get through those, but then also to celebrate some of the joys as well. And just so happy that the university honored her with that, the Elise M. Hood teacher for the University of Mississippi in 2018. I'm just so glad she got that recognition for her work, and just glad that she was willing to sit down with us on the podcast, and I could share that conversation with you. But that's about it. That's about it. That's about all the advice I have. And just one other thing, I guess, is if you get a chance to go either read the book, or there's lots of other stuff out there about Mr. Rogers, but there's also the movie coming out with Tom Hanks, I believe on the 22nd of November. We're recording this on the 18th, but go check it out. Go check it out. Mr. Rogers is someone who's had integrity. And one thing I learned about the word integrity is just this: it's integrated. Whatever it is, it's integrated. If you are who you are when the camera's on, when it's off, you're in your home, you're with your kids, you're out in public, you're with your family, whatever. It's a consistency. And Mr. Rogers, if anything, is consistent. And so check him out. He's an amazing guy. So that is all I have for episode 12 of the Amidon Planet podcast. Show notes for this episode can be found at amidonplanet.com/episode 12. Now, to support the podcast, there are many ways to support the podcast. You can subscribe in whatever platform you find these podcasts in. So you can do that. You can share the podcast. Maybe you heard something you like, think someone else needs to hear it, go ahead and email it to them. Rate or review the podcast through iTunes is usually where you see that, but wherever you do it, if you could do it, that'd be great. Like the Amidon Planet Facebook page. There you can comment on the podcast. Usually have a post associated with the podcast there where we announce it. Ask questions, bring up angles on the content. You can also share through that Facebook page. And you can also subscribe to the Amidon Planet email list, which you can find. There's a subscribe button on the Facebook page. There's also a subscribe button on AmidonPlanet.com. You can go there as well. Also, we're still selling shirts. The Be the Good shirts are selling again. So I've got it set up on Bonfire. So if someone buys a shirt, it opens up a window. We're recording this on the 18th. We're currently in a window where people can buy shirts, and they'll be sent out right around the first week of December. So if you want to buy a shirt, you can buy a shirt. All the proceeds go to support the production costs of the Amidon Planet podcast. You can find links to it on AmidonPlanet.com. There's a link on the header for store. There's a link at the bottom for store, and there is also a link in the show notes at AmidonPlanet.com/episode 12. Also, I have a Patreon account. You can search Amidon Planet Podcast through Patreon. So it just allows people to support the podcast by the episode, and if you want to do that. And also, so if you also just want to engage with me via the interwebs, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, all on the handle at Amidon Planet. Finally, thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode 12 of the Amidon Planet podcast. Thanks to Dr. Ann Monroe for taking the time to share her time and expertise and her passion for Fred Rogers. Thanks to Matt Mifflin for sharing some of his music for this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there who are seeking to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. Kind of like Fred Rogers. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you have been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do.